Hi, my name is Joseph Angelillo. I just finished my PhD in history at the University of Florida. I just finished it 13 days ago, actually, defended my dissertation. So that's cool. Happy about that. Uh, and so I'm here with my presentation, exceedingly old yet strikingly novel, The Origins of Racially Representative Juries in Reconstruction. So as you might be able to surmise, I talk about juries. Hard to believe, crazy. Um, so this presentation is about 2 chapters of my dissertation. It's a lot of one chapter and then a little bit of another chapter. And so these are ideas that I'm actively thinking about and actively trying to refine as I turn this into a book project. And so obviously all questions and comments and feedback is very welcome. But I first thing I'd like to open with is, oh, here we go. Do I point it there? How about now? All right, stand by, people. We're going to be okay. It's okay. All is well. There we go. Besides hello, I'd like to open with a brief story. So this handsome fella here is William H. Gray. William H. Gray was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of Arkansas in 1868. In 1868, Arkansas is redrawing its constitution because of, well, the Civil War. Essentially, after the war, states across the South had to redraw their constitutions as commanded by the federal government as a condition for readmission into the Union. Gray was one of the several black delegates at these conventions. These were known as the Black and Tan Conventions in a pejorative sense initially, but then somewhat in just a factual sense, known as the Black and Tan Conventions, mostly because these conventions seated both black and white delegates. The Arkansas Convention did not have a black majority. However, as a matter of fact, only one of those conventions sat a black majority, but all across the South, we were having these constitutional conventions. At the least, they had Republican majorities trying to reframe the laws of the South. Now, there were Democrats at these conventions, and of course, the Democrats, as you might imagine, weren't terribly pleased about this whole affair. They weren't terribly pleased about this whole affair because, well, as you probably know, the Democrats had recently fought a war to preserve and extend the institution of chattel slavery. 3 years after that war was over, they are now sitting in a convention hall rewriting their constitution next to people that they had in the very recent past tried to enslave. So the Dems were pretty upset with the whole proceeding. And so, as a result of this clash between Republicans and Democrats in these conventions, sometimes we would get debates over very easy questions for us, such as, was it a good idea to end slavery? At one point during the Arkansas convention, one of the Democratic delegates stood up and completely started laying into the issue of the Freedmen's Bureau. If we don't know what the Freedmen's Bureau was, the Freedmen's Bureau was a federal agency that was designed to help freed people in their transition from slavery to freedom. This Democratic delegate was saying that the Freedmen's Bureau was the worst blight ever enacted upon the freed person, except, and the Democratic delegate made a very, very important point, or he made sure the convention was understanding. He said this was the worst thing ever to happen to the black person, except for the end of slavery. And of course, all the Democratic delegates are cheering. They're like, yes, congratulations, you've made the best point on earth. William H. Gray was not going to sit and take that. He was not going to sit and listen to somebody say that it was bad that slavery had ended. So he stands up and he says, no, it is actually a very good thing that slavery is over. And then he started talking about the quality of justice that was being experienced by Arkansas blacks in the courts. Specifically, he talked about the juries. And he said that the all-white juries in the courts in Arkansas were not affording impartial justice. In opposition to the idea of the all-white jury, William H. Gray had this to say: the laws of this country declare that a man shall be entitled to an impartial trial by his peers. But the law of England, on which the law of America is based, provides that when a man on trial is a foreigner, the jury shall be de medietate. What does that mean? I don't speak Latin, so wow, what does that actually mean? By now, I hope we are getting at that I talk about juries. Before we go further into this question about juries and about the past and about Reconstruction, let's think broadly about juries, not just about juries in this context, but juries more broadly. The Constitution protects the right to an impartial jury. That's in the Sixth Amendment. Of my crowd here, have either of you served on a jury? You have served on a jury. Okay, wonderful. This is good. Just a few quick questions. First up, did you like that experience? It was okay. Did you feel like you were a peer of the defendant? Now, you don't have to answer this, but just kind of think to yourself, what made you think that? I'm not trying to say that you weren't, but I'm trying to just spur that thought. What made you think that? What made you the peer, and what made a peer, right? Did you feel like you were an impartial juror? And once again, not doubting you, but what makes you think that? What makes us think that someone is a peer, that someone is impartial? These are the core questions that I get at with my research. What does it actually mean to be one's peer? What does it mean to be impartial? What does race have to do with any of this? And most importantly, can people overcome prejudice? What do any of these questions have to say about people's ability to overcome prejudice? I used the Civil War and Reconstruction to talk about these questions because this period is rife with these questions. What does it mean to live with another group and to be their peer? What does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to be impartial? And obviously the Civil War and Reconstruction are rife with questions of prejudice and what it means and what race is. To understand these questions, we should first think about the history of the jury, not just in broad questions, but in the actual meaning of the jury and why the jury exists. At core, the jury is a group of 12 people charged by the state, little s state, not big S state, charged by the state with deciding the outcome of a trial. Typically a criminal trial. Sometimes these trials, of course, have to do with private matters. Juries have a very long and rich history. It's probably one of the more esteemed and well-regarded institutions that we trace all the way back to pre-modern England. For the jury, and I know these jurors don't look particularly pleased to be there, but trust me, they're important. Before the jury, most criminal justice was, in a word, unreliable or unfair. Those are two words, but you can choose either one. Before the jury, most criminal justice relied on one of three methods. One was the trial by ordeal. The trial by ordeal is basically where you took a criminal defendant and you put them in a very extreme, probably life-threatening situation. So an example of this was during the Salem witch trials, the only person not hung was a person that was crushed to death by rocks. They had to lay down and progressively heavier rocks were placed upon their chest. The idea of the trial by ordeal was that if you were innocent, God would save you. Trial by ordeal. The second is trial by oath, much less dangerous. Someone comes, you take an oath, you say you were innocent, you swear upon God's word that you were innocent, so therefore you were innocent. The most dangerous form of pre-modern trial was trial by combat, which is basically what it sounds like. Much like the trial by ordeal, the idea is that if you prevail, if you survive, then that means God willed it, so you were innocent. The problem with all of these methods of pre-modern criminal justice was they don't actually use evidence. In order to interact with human reasoning, you have to present people with evidence that they can all grasp. Trial by ordeal, trial by combat, trial by oath, none of these things are verifiable independently. And so it became actually a concern of the king to find a method of trial that used evidence, that ensured reliable and even criminal justice. Thus emerges the inquest. The inquest is essentially the predecessor to the trial by jury. Basically, what would happen in the inquest is that the king's agents would go to a locality where there had been a crime and they would question local people about the crime. Why would they use local people? Well, local people probably understood what had happened. It was probably the talk of the town. Some of them might have actually seen the crime. So this logic of the knowledge of local people and how valuable it is, this translates into the pre-modern jury. The idea of the pre-modern jury being that 12 people drawn from the surrounding area would decide the fate of a defendant. Notably, pre-modern jurors did not hear testimony. Pre-modern jurors were testimony. Pre-modern jurors themselves provided the testimony. Not only did they provide the testimony because the legal profession didn't really exist back then, so there weren't like lawyers in the way we would think of lawyers now. The fact is that by the logic of the pre-modern jury, local jurors were the ones who knew what happened. So these local jurors, these 12 people, typically 12 men, of course, would sit around, discuss what had happened, and render a verdict. So we see the logic here of the pre-modern jury. In order to pursue fairness, we need knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? Factual knowledge. Where does factual knowledge come from? The locality. So the original definition of one's peer was very much hinged on location. That's what mattered more than anything. The most, or an interesting derivative of the pre-modern jury was the English mixed jury, the jury di medietate linguae. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Do you think I am pronouncing that right? Do you think I am? Do you think maybe? Okay, that's some confidence. I appreciate it. From this point forward, I'm referring to it as the English mixed jury, though, just to be safe. The logic of the English mixed jury, it's a little hard to explain, but I'll give you an example of how it might work in this context, the context we're in. But the way that the English mixed jury would work was if someone committed a crime in a community in which they did not belong, they would be tried, of course, where they had committed the crime, but half of their jurors would come from their hometown. The reason being that these jurors from their hometown can provide contextual knowledge. Pre-modern juries used local jurors to create knowledge, but this is factual knowledge, knowledge of what happened. The English mixed jury basically said that we will include the defendant, we will include jurors from the defendant's hometown, not to introduce factual knowledge of what happened, but contextual knowledge. Why might the defendant have done that? Not what did the defendant do, but why might they have done that? It's a little confusing, but let's take an example with here in Gainesville. What is unique about Gainesville? What's unique about Gainesville is the University of Florida, obviously. All right. I understand there's also a million other things unique about Florida, Gainesville, but UF. Let's start with that. Given that the University of Florida is here and the Gators are our mascot, what is every citizen of Gainesville apt to do at some point in their life? Exactly, the Gator chomp. That's exactly it. At some point or another, a Gaines villager, as I like to call them, will Gator chomp. They may do it because they want to. It might be ironic. I've had a lot of students who don't particularly care about sports, and they'll Gator chomp just to say, haha, I'm above this. So imagine that you, the Gaines villager who Gator chomps by instinct or just because you feel like it today, you go to a different, say you go to Tampa and you Gator chomp. But you didn't know that in Tampa, for some reason, it's illegal. Why is it illegal in Tampa? No clue. Is it actually legal in Tampa? Probably not. But imagine it is illegal in Tampa. Once again, how would that happen? I don't know. Florida has weird laws sometimes. So you're under arrest. You're going to be put on trial in Tampa for violating the local ordinance against gator chomping. Under the logic of the English mixed jury, half your jurors are going to be from Gainesville. And so when they go into deliberations, they can say, I understand that the defendant gator chomp and that's against the local ordinances here. You need to understand, though, that they're from Gainesville and that's just second nature here. So that's the idea of the English mixed jury, that the English mixed jury will introduce context, contextual knowledge to the deliberations around a defendant for the purpose of giving them a fairer trial. This was once again the jury to which William H. Gray had discussed at the Arkansas Constitutional Convention. But William H. Gray was not talking about jurors from different locations. He was talking about jurors of different races. So how does that make sense? How is he using the English mixed jury while discussing jurors of different races? The question, or the answer to that question, of course, we have to think about racial prejudice. To talk about racial prejudice in U.S. history, especially during this era, to say it was bad, of course, is an understatement. To say it is the worst that it ever has been is probably somewhat inaccurate. It might have even been worse in the early 1910s. But to call it the prejudice of centuries is probably correct. And who used the phrase prejudice of centuries? You bet William H. Gray did. I like this guy a lot. He has a lot of good zingers. The prejudice of centuries, he called it. In the South and in the North as well, the general idea was that a racial binary existed. There was no middle ground. Blacks on one side, whites on the other. Whites were held to be creative and capable of critical thinking and expansive thinking. On the other side of the racial binary, black people were thought to be inherently inferior, thought to be perpetual children, thought to be incapable of higher level thinking, intellectually inferior and emotionally unstable. These were the ideas surrounding black people in the racial binary. Obviously, we understand all of this is incorrect. We understand that race is a construct. But this is the prejudice that people like William H. Gray and recently freed black Southerners were facing during the Reconstruction era. And obviously, this prejudice was going to prevent any understanding of an impartial jury or of impartiality or fairness in general. Perhaps the best example of this are black codes. This image is broadly representative of Southern black codes. You would be forgiven, by the way, for thinking that this image depicted a slave auction. You would be forgiven for thinking that because we have a black man in chains on a stoop, if you will, on an auction block, and people appearing to be, we have an auctioneer, it appears. You would be forgiven for thinking that this is a slave auction. The giveaway that it's not a slave auction is that the person being sold is wearing shoes, so you can figure out that this is after slavery. This drawing is from 1867. It's from 2 years after the war. What we are seeing here is not the auction of an enslaved person, but the auction of a person who was found guilty of violating a Southern black code. After the war, the South passed numerous laws that attempted to, as much as they could, recreate slavery. These laws made criminal very, very light offenses, such as vagrancy, or very, very vague offenses, such as vagrancy. Petty theft was made a very, very severe crime. It was put into law that black people had to sign terms of labor annually. This was not required of white people. And that if they violated these terms of labor, they were once again a vagrant. And usually these crimes were punishable by very severe sentences, either in jail or in terms of labor. So images like this are reaching the North in 1867-ish of black people once again being sold on the auction block. And it appears that the war has not resolved much. Point being, through all of this, black codes demonstrate the depth of racial prejudice that existed in the South after the war, and black codes involve juries. These are crimes. The defendants had to face trial, which means that a jury had to decide their fate. So this is why William H. Gray brought up the English mixed jury when he talked about race and justice. In William H. Gray's mind, in the mind of many others like him as well, Gray was facing the prejudice of centuries, and he felt that this prejudice meant that there was almost no guarantee of a fair trial. In order to ensure fair trials in the pre-modern era, jurors had been relied on for knowledge. However, juror knowledge had previously been found by drawing jurors from the locality, right? Either from the locality of the crime for facts or the locality of the defendant for context. Jurors use knowledge to ensure fairness. This means inclusion of peers. So these are the old ideas that William H. Gray was drawing on, the exceedingly old idea that jurors introduce knowledge and you need to deliberately include people who understand the context of the defendant. You need to deliberately include people who understand the lived experiences of the defendant. The strikingly new idea that William H. Gray advanced was that knowledge does not come from the locality. After all, or knowledge of the lived experiences of a defendant and the context of a defendant does not come from the locality. After all, white people lived in many of the same places as black people in the South immediately after the war. By William H. Gray's reasoning, and other people's reasoning too, though, locality was not going to give you fair jurors. What was going to give you fair jurors were people who actually understood the lived experience of what it was to be a black criminal defendant or to be a black person in any regard. So therefore, by their calculation, knowledge comes not from locality, but from racial identity. Exceedingly old, the idea that you need jurors who understand the context of the defendant. Strikingly new, the idea that context comes not from location, but from racial identity. So this gives us a new definition of what it means to be one's peer. That a peer is not necessarily someone who lives in the locality, but someone who can experience any number of things that gives them understanding of lived experience. And in this scenario, race. So we have a new racialized definition of peers. These ideas had some influence among politicians. In 1875, Congress passed a law saying that you can't keep black people off of juries because they're black. This is a good law. We enjoy this law. This law is still standing, actually. In defending this law, Republicans are emphasized that they needed to protect the rights of black defendants. They argued particularly that all white juries meant that black people were being judged by prejudice and not by peers. Oliver Morton, who was a leading Republican with a good beard and hair, Oliver Morton, in defending this law, which was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, gave this quote: "To give the exclusive right to white men to sit upon juries and to adjudicate upon the rights of colored men is denying to colored men the equal protection of the laws, because it is placing the adjudication of their rights exclusively in the hands of another race, importantly, filled with prejudice and passion in many states that would prevent them from doing justice," essentially saying that the prejudice held by white people is preventing them from sitting as peers to black defendants, especially those in the South. Now, I want to be completely frank here. I want to be open with you because, well, this is how research and scholarship works. This is not an easy interpretation to uphold. This is not a simple interpretation to uphold. Essentially, the idea being advocated for by William H. Gray and tons of black activists like him and people like Morton and senators like Charles Sumner, the idea being advocated is that in order to have a fair trial for a black defendant, you have to have black jurors. It's not an option. In a way, that's democratic. It's kind of pro-democracy. Essentially, I mean, let's think about democracy for a moment. The whole point of democracy is to find a way for people to live amongst each other without killing each other, right? I guess that's the whole point of government. But the whole point of democracy is that you can have people deciding what to do, people deciding how to govern, and that can happen without mass chaos and violence. Deliberately including black jurors is a way to prevent violence. It's a way to ensure fairness. The reason being, once again, that if you deliberately include black jurors, you are including jurors who have knowledge of the defendant and therefore will probably help undermine prejudice. So that's democratic. It's also democratic because one of the core ideas of democracy is that if people contribute their ideas of how things should go, that people will disagree about these things. When they disagree, these ideas can sharpen each other. This is what we know as the free exchange of ideas. The idea that we have to have all sorts of ideas included so that these ideas can rebut each other, and then these ideas can get better, and these ideas can sharpen off of each other. Point being that when you include more perspectives into deliberation, you generally get a better result. That's the idea of the free exchange of ideas. The idea of the free exchange of ideas. That was well stated. That's the point of the free exchange of ideas. So purposeful inclusion of black jurors kind of coincides with this objective of democracy. More perspectives included means a richer deliberation and a richer free exchange of ideas. So it's democratic, certainly. But it's also anti-democratic. When William H. Gray is talking about the prejudice of centuries, he is insinuating something. He's insinuating that white people can't overcome prejudice. That's a tricky thing to reconcile with democracy. The core idea of democracy, probably the most important idea of democracy, is that people can be trusted to overcome their passions and govern themselves. You can take it back to all the original thinkers. Take it back to Locke. Government of the people is feasible, supposedly, because people are capable of looking past the things that upset them and looking past their prejudices and overcoming their passions and finding a way to find the common good. Arguing that if you have someone of a certain identity, they have to be judged by that identity, essentially is saying that that identity cannot be overcome. That prejudice cannot be overcome. So this is a difficult interpretation. It's both pro-democratic and to a certain degree anti-democratic. And I don't necessarily have the solution, but I will say arguing that black people must be judged by black jurors, this seems to reek a little bit of racial separatism, right? Of the idea that these experiences are just so separate that may as well have different societies. I will tell you, the people that were advocating for mixed race juries were not advocating separatism. These are some quotes from one of many colored conventions. The colored conventions assembled in the 19th century. These were conventions, as you might suspect, mostly of black activists. They met to pass resolutions, at first against slavery, and then once slavery had ended, in favor of racial equality. One of these conventions was held in Georgia. They passed a resolution saying, we claim the right under the rules of common law to be tried for all offenses by a jury of our peers, and they specified the white man is not our peer. In a separate resolution, this is your country, but it is ours too. You were born here, so were we. Your fathers fought for it, but our fathers fed them. We shall expect to remain in your midst till Providence at least orders a plan of separation. The fact that these two resolutions exist in the same convention, that's not coincidence. Demands that black people be judged by black jurors are not essentially the seeds of a revolution or the seeds of separatism. It is instead many black activists trying to find a way to coexist in the South. As I'll talk about when I'm back here next week talking about juries again, these movements for mixed race juries were essentially a way that black people were trying to find a way to coexist in the South with whites, to find a way to remain in your midst until Providence at least orders a plan of separation. So these interpretations are difficult. They are difficult, but it's not exactly a plan of separation. So this is all well and good, right? We like these ideas. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. But these ideas at least have an intellectual grounding. And theory is cool. But I think Fred Hampton, who was one of the leaders of the Black Panthers in Chicago, I believe he once said something to the effect of, theory is cool, but it doesn't matter unless there's actual grounding, unless these things actually happen. And so comes the question, does this work? Were these theories correct? The principal theory espoused by these ideas is that black jurors ensure black safety. That's the core. The idea being that black jurors ensure black safety. Do these ideas work? It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because it's hard to gauge just how much racial identity correlates with trial outcomes. In fact, it's hard to correlate how any identity correlates with trial outcomes. People have tried to do that research. It's hard to establish correlation between identity of jurors and what actually happens in jury deliberations, especially because jury deliberations are secret. Jury deliberations don't produce records. But there was one crucial moment in the history of the U.S. South that allowed us to really examine what is the influence of the black juror upon criminal justice. Do black jurors actually create safety? That moment where the trial of the Ku Klux Klan, trials, I should say, of the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina in 1871 and 72. Just a brief aside. This is a good book, by the way. I would recommend this book, Ku Klux by Elaine France Parsons. I'm always befuddled by the fact that the Klan, not that they wore disguises. I get why they wore disguises. I'm befuddled that they wore something that looks this terrifying, and this person thought, history's going to remember me well. This person wore this and thought, yeah, my kids will see this image and think he was on the good side. I am going to put this on, go commit violence, and people are going to smile at me from the future. That I will always find that confusing. I'm sure that there is a very meticulous idea behind this particular outfit, but as I've said, I've always found that a very interesting tidbit of history. I'm sure many of us have heard of the Klan. We know the Klan was a paramilitary white supremacist organization. The Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. I myself am from Tennessee. I've never been to Pulaski, actually. The Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee for the express purpose of keeping black people from exercising their new rights. These rights had grown tremendously since the war. We are aware of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution basically says that all laws have to be applied equally to black and white. And then the 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote. This last change to the Constitution, this last change in rights, was especially horrifying to the Klan. Remember, Southern whites lived under the delusion that black people were inherently incapable of higher thinking, impartial thinking, of intelligence. So when the Klan sees black men voting, they see this as a disturbance to the very fabric of society. They are also starting to see black men on juries because black men do start to serve on juries in small numbers in the late 1860s. The jury was a way that the community judged itself. What they are seeing then are black men taking part in governance to a certain degree. And so the Klan, with violence, attempted to undo all of this. The Klan's typical method was whipping. The Klan would go out to the house, typically of a black voter, call them out in the middle of the night, and whip them until the voter pledged never to vote the Republican ticket again, or they would sometimes have to pledge that they would leave, that they would hit the road and never come back. Obviously, murder was rather common for Klansmen. Not as common as whipping, but murders were happening to the point that, well, any observer was alarmed. Northern observer, I should say. Most Southerners had some level of sympathy for the Klan. Also common was sexual assault among Klansmen. Sexual assault served the Klan in two ways. It restored a sense of power that they felt that they lost with slavery, and sexual assault was a secondary means of voter intimidation, essentially. The Klan was most active in upcountry South Carolina. Upcountry South Carolina is essentially the western half of the state. Upcountry South Carolina has a white majority as opposed to the low country, which borders the Atlantic Ocean. The low country South Carolina has a very sizable black majority. And so the Klan was most active in this section of South Carolina with a white majority. In 1871, the federal government declared that upcountry South Carolina was an open rebellion against the government. President Grant essentially says that there is a rebellion happening because the Klan is destroying any sense of ordered government, which was factually true. And so the Department of Justice went in and they started arresting Klansmen. Not only are they arresting Klansmen, they're having to start to put Klansmen on trial. So we have an issue. If you're going to put the Klan on trial, you need jurors who are going to convict. Most federal officials started to understand the rhetoric that had been espoused by people like William H. Gray, that you need black jurors to protect black safety. So therefore, many federal officials embraced the idea that you were going to need black jurors for the Klan cases. That was one reason why the Klan cases sat a lot of black jurors. The second reason was much more practical. The Klan was prosecuted under a law known as the Enforcement Act. It was the Enforcement Act of 1870. Under the Enforcement Act of 1870, if you wanted to sit as a juror on one of those cases dealing with the law, you had to swear an oath that you had never participated in a Klan activity. Believe me when I say this, almost no white man in upcountry South Carolina could truthfully swear that oath. Whether willingly or unwillingly, and there were some white men who were forced to take part in the Klan, but pretty much every South Carolina white person had some sympathy for the Klan. Whether willingly or unwillingly, there really were no white men capable of serving on these juries without committing perjury. So, as a result, the juries in the Klan cases were almost all 2/3 black, at least 2/3 black. Many of them were 3/4 black. What did these jurors have to go through? What was the experience of being a black juror, especially in the Klan cases? Generally, I've broken this down into 3 sections as to what black jurors in the Klan cases experienced, and black jurors in general, what they experienced. That being boredom and confusion, publicity, and prejudice. So we'll take those one at a time. Boredom and confusion. Sir, I don't know what your experience on the jury was like. Maybe you had a thrilling time and it was a cool case. The typical experience of a juror is different, though, and it is not isolated to black jurors. Almost all jurors have to deal with a simple fact. Law is complex. Testimony is complex. And sometimes expert testimony does what is happening to this fella here and this lady, and actually most of them, it puts you to sleep. Also, being a juror is somewhat costly. In the modern day, it's literally costly because jurors are paid less than minimum wage. In the 19th century, the money wasn't the big issue. The issue was just time. Trials last time. That's time spent away from your work. And so black jurors weren't so unique in that they experience boredom and confusion in the jury box. And that's not due to anything racial, that's due to jury service. So that's not unique. What is unique is publicity. Black jurors faced immense publicity and undue publicity, I might argue. The reason being was that it was a pretty typical thing in the whole United States, not just in the South. The names of jurors would almost always be published in the papers. When black people started serving on juries, most of these newspapers started denoting who was a black juror and who was white. You can see in this example here on the left, the names of black jurors. If they were a black juror, it would be their name, then comma colored, comma colored, comma colored. Meanwhile, on this example on the right, those in italics are colored jurors. There weren't a lot of black jurors on this particular list that I took a screenshot of here. Point being, though, that those black jurors that were on those lists, their name were in italics. Some other newspapers would do like columns. It's like in the left column are the white jurors and the right column are the black jurors. Point being here, it was well known who was a black person and serving on a jury. Why is that a terribly bad thing? It wasn't an abnormal practice to publish the names of jurors. The problem is, though, this certainly opens up black jurors to intimidation. And juror intimidation was a problem. It was a problem to the point that in 1872, the Congress actually passed a law against jury intimidation. Prejudice. This is probably the thing experienced by almost all black jurors. Prejudice comes from a lot of places. It comes from the press, who print wild stories. It comes from white lawyers. It comes from white jurors. Many white jurors would stand up and refuse to serve if a black person had been drawn onto the panel. And so prejudice comes from a lot of directions. It even comes from judges in some cases. Prejudice takes two forms. The first is, or I should say, prejudice takes two narratives. The first narrative communicated about black jurors is that they are less intelligent than white jurors. Coming from the Southern press, this probably isn't surprising given notions of race, but obviously it's still a problem. The Southern press was publishing crazy stories about black jurors, absolutely crazy stories. There were some stories saying that black jurors weren't doing any of the business they were supposed to be doing because they were busy standing up and making speeches about land seizure. That probably didn't happen. Another story alleged that one black juror had stood up in the middle of a case and said, "Judge, that's it. I've heard all the testimony I need to hear. I'm ready to hear a decision." And of course, the judge responds, "No, you have to listen to all the testimony." Black juror says, "Nope, I'm ready to go." That story also probably did not happen. Many stories basically said that black jurors were sleepier than white jurors. All of these stories were trying to communicate the idea that black jurors were apathetic and, of course, unintelligent. And these stories, like I said, many of them are so ridiculous as to question their actual veracity. That was the first narrative communicated about black jurors. The second narrative was that black jurors were not impartial. The second narrative was that black jurors themselves actually could not overcome prejudice. That black jurors themselves were racially prejudiced against whites and in favor of blacks. This wasn't just the press communicating this idea, though the press communicates this idea a lot. White lawyers communicated this idea. Turning back to the Klan cases, this is Fitzwilliam McMaster. Fitzwilliam McMaster defended one of the Klansmen on trial in the Klan cases. He takes the opportunity to insult the very jury he's talking to. The world has never seen a greater outrage than the jury that is now trying this question. I want to just pause here. I'm not a lawyer. I did 2 years of mock trial in college. Is that law school? No, it's not. But I feel like it's fair to say, and I don't know if either of you are lawyers, maybe you were a lawyer, I don't know. I think it's probably fair to say that rule number one of being a trial attorney is don't insult the jury. That seems logical to me. This man couldn't help himself. The world has never seen a greater outrage than the jury that is now trying this question. The the Klan's lawyers said a lot of stuff kind of like this, and also saying openly, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't think you can rise above your prejudice. The Klan's lawyers openly questioned the ability of black jurors to decide these cases fairly. And people like Fitzwilliam McMaster would then call on the black jurors with quotations like this, that black men have the opportunity of rising above his prejudices and doing justice not only to a political enemy, but to a white man who is charged with being connected with a conspiracy whose object was to drive the black man from the soil of South Carolina. Complex quote a bit. I just want to point out, nowhere here does he actually deny that his client did it. This was kind of a typical thing. Essentially, these lawyers saying, I'm not saying my client didn't do it. I'm saying that if you want to prove that you are impartial, you'll acquit my defendant. If you want to prove that you can be fair to whites, you'll acquit this white person. And in fact, many of these Klan lawyers would go on to defend the Klan. Not defend the Klan in terms of defending the Klansmen, which of course they were doing. They would actually say that the Klan's activities were logical. They weren't denying the Klan's activities. They were saying, can you blame the Klan for doing what it does? And so when I say that black jurors faced prejudice, they faced lawyers like this who are essentially saying to them, this is a bad jury. I don't know if you should be doing this. I don't think you're capable of sitting as a juror. Prove to me that you are by showing that the Klan is okay. I cannot imagine what it was like to sit as a black juror and see that. I'm Italian. If I sat on a jury and someone was telling me that it was perfectly okay to just take all the Italians and push them somewhere else, I'd be a little miffed. I cannot imagine what it's like to be a black man sitting in these cases, these very charged cases, and being told, I don't know if you're impartial. Maybe you should acquit the Klan to show that you are. I can't imagine what that was like. I can't imagine anger or frustration like that. Did that stop these black jurors from doing their jobs? No, not really. The Klan cases resulted in an almost perfect conviction record in South Carolina. 22 convictions, only 2 dismissals. One of those dismissals was an acquittal. The other was a mistrial. So 22 for 24. That may not sound like a lot because the Klan had hundreds, maybe thousands of members in South Carolina. And usually when we think about the small number of cases versus the high number of Klansmen, we can criticize the federal government for not prosecuting more. But when you look at this from the perspective of the jurors, it kind of proves the theory that black jurors will protect black safety. So in a way, this almost perfect conviction record does, to a certain degree, test and somewhat vindicate the idea here that black jurors will restore safety for black people. These cases served their purpose. I say peace restored for a moment. What I mean there, the Klan had to go underground after these cases. The Klan was broken up and didn't really have a resurgence again until the 20th century. The 1872 national elections were the most peaceful of Reconstruction. They were probably the only peaceful elections of Reconstruction. This was directly during and after the Klan cases. Peace was restored for a moment. Peace did not last. Mass violence once again broke out in the South in 1873. And the government did nothing to prosecute it. This time it wasn't Klan violence. The violence that broke out in 1873 was of a different nature. The Ku Klux Klan was broken, but they were different organizations. We don't have to get into that. What I can say is this is proof of a different issue. Black jurors restored safety to the South for a moment, but they couldn't do it alone. Black jurors could not unilaterally settle the South. There had to be some government assistance. In closing, we've come quite far. We have come quite far. We've discussed the intellectual basis for purposeful inclusion of black jurors, rooted in ideas that are exceedingly old, the idea that jurors should understand context, and strikingly new, the idea that context comes from racial identity. We've thought about how these ideas were tested. We've thought about what it was like to live as a black juror. What was it like to experience life in the jury box while being black? And so this comes back to my major questions. All this matters because it helps us think crucially, not just about the jury, but about democracy. Who is a peer? Lived experiences matter. It's not just locality. You also have to think about what somebody has been through. In this context, race, but other contexts matter too. What does it mean to be impartial? How do we fulfill the requirements of impartiality? Obviously, once again, lived experiences, inclusion of people who provide context, that has to matter a little bit. And can we overcome prejudice? Once again, it's a difficult question, one that I don't have an answer to. But the intellectual case for mixed juries does not totally discount the idea that black people, or not black people, that all people, I'm sorry, can overcome prejudice. When William H. Gray called on ideas that were exceedingly old yet strikingly novel, he did not abandon the idea that blacks and whites could coexist. None of the demands, I would argue that none of the demands for purposely mixed race juries were arguing that blacks and whites can't coexist. They were, I would argue that they were an attempt to find a way to coexist in the South with whites. But they had to protect black safety. That was most important. I like to close with another quote from Gray. Gray had a very good speech in 1868, like I said. He closed with this statement, calling for equality. I want every jot and tittle. I want you to pay the bill in full. Give me the right of citizenship. Give me perfect equality before the law. I will receipt the bill in full and ask nothing more. And for him, perfect equality before the law meant that the jurors that judged people like him needed to understand where he was coming from. And for him, that meant mixed juries. Thank you. I've been walking around the whole time, so I'm going to sit. Okay. Gotta. I hope everyone's doing okay. I'm going to put this back up here now. Questions? I am curious about your experience with on the jury. If you would like to talk about that. What if you're comfortable, whatever you can. Well, let's do this. If you had a question for me, please go ahead and ask that, and after that we can talk about your experience on the jury. Thank you. Appreciate that. So no, I just finished a PhD in U.S. history, and so I uh, these are kind of this is kind of the intellectual history side of my book project. I'm about to start a job at the University of Alabama, actually. Roll Tide are words I never thought I was going to say, but now I have to say them a lot, I guess. Um, and so, the idea with this, with all this research is to turn it into a book project that will hopefully be appealing mostly to historians, but hopefully also to legal scholars and maybe just fingers crossed to people generally interested in the questions of democracy. I really think the most important question from this research is it's a commentary on prejudice, and it's a commentary on people's ability to overcome prejudice. Because personally, my own moral compass says that people are capable of overcoming prejudice. I generally think people are good. But I don't think William H. Gray was wrong when he talked about the prejudice of centuries. I think that as someone who studies the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's hard to reconcile the idea that people are inherently good with the realities of that situation. And so what I want to do with this kind of presentation and this kind of research is to turn it into more or less a commentary on that difficulty If that makes sense? Thank you. So I recently received a faculty teaching job essentially. It's essentially a lecturer position. The formal title is full-time instructor. So I'll be my job will be teaching legal history courses. I'll be teaching 4 legal history courses a semester, uh, advising pre-law students as well. Very exciting things. I'm really looking forward to it. I got very lucky. I got very lucky on the job market. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I mean, juries are difficult. I want to be open about that too. Juries there's a lot of criticism you can levy towards the jury aside from the issue of prejudice, right? Because that's kind of the nub of what I'm talking about is the issue of juries and prejudice. Juries are difficult for other reasons too. Many people would argue that, and it kind of goes toward the boredom and confusion thing. Many people would argue that lay jurors, lay people are not actually equipped to handle difficult cases. We know that jurors can get it wrong. The jury also is, yeah, the jury is susceptible to prejudice, as I've discussed. Also, the jury might not make sense in a democracy because the jury makes sense, right, in a monarchy, for example, because it's the last line of defense between centralized authority and people. In a democracy, the laws are made by people. So the argument there is that juries, instead of protecting the people, can actually subvert law that was made by people in a democracy. So the jury is kind of difficult to sustain in a democracy if you presume that the laws are indeed reflective of the public will. That's a little confusing, I think, but and of course we have another issue with juries, which is that they're not they're not typically predictable. You never know what's going to happen in front of a jury. I mean, every lawyer, every district attorney who brings a case has to think, I might have the most robust evidence on earth, but is a jury going to buy it? And so, yeah, it's an interesting institution in the modern day. I, of course, would argue that they are essential, and we need, to step back from plea bargaining and embrace trial by jury more than we currently do. But that's just me and my wild theories. Yeah. No, that's fine. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.